Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you are doing well. And today I am bringing you an exclusive and hopefully in-depth conversation with writer, music critic, Eli Enis, also the co-host of two fantastic music podcasts that you can check out in the D box down below, Endless Scroll and Violent Treatment. Eli recently had a pretty big and controversial piece that grabbed my attention and many others in Stereogum recently. Metal's stadium class is less metal than ever. He goes over a lot of the biggest and most modern contemporary groups in metal currently that are filling its biggest venues, its biggest shows, headlining some of its biggest festivals, and talks about how aesthetically, in terms of spirit and ethos, these bands are actually not quite as metal as a lot of the forefathers of the genre that came before. I want to talk about that and basically anything else that comes up in the conversation. I thought it was a thoughtful piece overall. It's really, really, really in-depth. We'll link it down below too, so you guys can check it out as well on YouTube. For anybody who's watching on Twitch, again, Metal Stadium Class is less metal than ever. It's on Stereogum now. Eli, thank you for coming through. Tell me how you sort of came to start, I guess, coming together with the blueprint for this piece and what kind of inspired you to kind of analyze the upper crust popularity-wise of metal at the moment right now.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So basically, I worked in metal media for the last 3 years, and my job was basically to engage with and cover the most popular, trendy bands in metal for the most part. So I was engaging a lot as a writer with Sleep Token, with Bad Omens, with Avenged Sevenfold, with the sort of, like you said, the upper crust, the upper echelon, the most popular bands in the genre. But of course, I was familiar with these bands and have long been into metal since I was a kid, so very familiar with mainstream metal. But through covering that and kind of thinking about it over the years, I developed a lot of observations, I feel like, and strong opinions, as my piece lays out, on the sort of state of arena level, if not stadium metal at the moment. And basically what I came to develop as a thesis is that, metal is more influenced in a lot of ways right now by mainstream pop rock at the very least than metal. And like you said, aesthetically, sonically, spiritually, I feel like, and that thesis is kind of a value neutral judgment. I feel like I think it's actually not a bad thing inherently by any means, as someone who loves genres being meshed and whatnot, and innovations across all musical forms, that metal is mixing with pop. I just, as my article lays out, think that a lot of those fusions happening right now at the upper decks of metal are actually pretty clumsy and not appealing to listen to, in my opinion.
Mm. I mean, outside of okay. Let me try to get you to dig into some of the stuff that you're kind of
Sure.
claiming in the piece here. Like when we compare the mainstream eras of metal music and kind of separate it out by decade, like what are you hearing aesthetically and sonically from today as opposed to like some of the bigger acts that you talk about from the 90s in like thrash or groove metal, for example? Like sonically, what do you hear in terms of like a major difference in terms of what speaks to you as kind of this new crop of bands being less metal per se? Because I mean, I guess at least to my ears, one group that you do bring up, for example, Spirit Box, while it is true, a lot of the stuff that you say in the piece in terms of their influences are most definitely there, crossing over from pop and other various genres, also to me, given the age that I am and the time that I came up listening to, various forms of alternative music, a lot of what they do rings to me as like, a recycle of what Evanescence did back in the day.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
And certainly while even when they were around, they weren't seen as like the most hard or aggressive or most metal type act out there. I mean, you could say that they were like pop infused as well for their time. But I don't know if you could sort of like, pick out Evanescence per se and say, hey, Evanescence, this is like proof that the genre's less metal than it is. They were sort of like almost a red herring in a way. Or, I mean, I guess you could say that maybe they're not, because obviously they have somebody who's kind of a torchbearer for them, Spirit Box, but, they weren't necessarily sort of like, proof that the genre was kind of moving one way or another as a whole, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly like the early 2000s are definitely a pretty comparable analog, I feel like, to the current moment in some ways. Whereas you had, as I mentioned in the article, Evanescence and Linkin Park are pretty much the two biggest metal bands, if you want to call them that, of the early 2000s. Very, very pop influenced, very, very melodic bands. I think the difference is like even then, those bands existed, but there was just more popular metal bands. Metal as a whole was bigger
Mm.
and could sort of withstand more large bands competing in arenas and huge venues than there is in the present day, where the audience has shrunk, or at least it seems that way. Because even when there was Evanescence and Linkin Park, at the same time you had bands like Lamb of God and Gojira and Mastodon and you know Meshuggah, super super heavy bands who got very popular. They've become headlining acts, festival headliners in the last 20 years, who are playing a much more traditional, or at least like a heavier form of music. Whereas today, if you basically run down the list of the biggest bands who are set to inherit that throne, as I kind of argue, like the bands who will be headlining metal festivals in 5 years, if not already in 10 years, when a lot of these older bands retire, are more in the Evanescence Linkin Park lane, where they're basically a pop band with metal elements. And I would say the difference between a band like Sleep Token or Bad Omens or Bring Me the Horizon, for example, that who are, bigger than Spirit Box and are sort of the biggest at the moment, like they're blending pop and metal in a way that I think is just more extreme than any previous pop metal acts who have gained that level of popularity, to where the types of pop they're drawing from are like the biggest pop artists in the world. Whereas like Bad Omens are explicitly drawing from The Weeknd, and Sleep Token, while they may not admit it, are obviously very similar in sound to Imagine Dragons and the sort of like stadium rock of the 2010s that a lot of people say carved out a lot of what rock music had traditionally been in the decades prior. And Bring Me the Horizon being an act who are super super into modern pop music, do songs with Lil Uzi Vert, who's more connected to the sound of mainstream pop than, for instance, Ice Cube was when he did a feature on Korn's Children of the Corn. So like,
Sure.
there's been interactions between pop and metal for many many years now. You could say hair metal was that it as well, which it certainly was. But I just feel like the bubblegum pop, if you want to call it that, or at least like the sort of like the very very most popular pop artists ever, are having more influence on metal right now than has ever happened in the genre's history, looking at the most popular bands in the genre.
And do you think this is like something that's going to progress in this direction further and further and further? I guess to your point, I was playing devil's advocate a little bit earlier, but I do agree. I think in a lot of these popular metal bands, we are seeing more of an embrace of pop aesthetics than we ever have before. But simultaneously, how much further do you think we could go down this road before, even the audiences of these bands kind of realize, like, I feel like we're not really listening to, metal anymore, even to the degree that, you're saying that I feel like if it goes any further than this, I don't know, there could be a wake up call at some point, and they kind of realize, I kind of want something harder. I kind of want something heavier. We've lost all the riffs, and we've lost even the breakdowns, which, I mean, you say at one point in the piece, like the riff has kind of been replaced by the breakdown in a way because of the way metalcore kind of dominated throughout the 2000s. But we've lost all of these harder, more aggressive elements to the point where there needs to be a reset, and that needs to come back in some way, shape, or form. Do you feel like we could continue progressing down this road and things kind of lighten and sweeten and become even more pop centric than they are now? And will we eventually hit a wall with that? Possibly.
I think it's certainly possible. I mean, look at what Linkin Park did. They became essentially a very just melodic radio rock band by the end of the 2000s, and then just became a straight up electro pop act in the 2010s. So I think that these bands, I think a band, there's almost no question that a band like Sleep Token are going to continue to get more melodic. That doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of heavier bands in the underground, or below this sort of festival headlining tier, they're doing more extreme forms of metal that inevitably a large portion of these fan bases will eventually develop a hankering for and go find. Like every generation needs its gateway bands. I'm not saying that that Sleep Token are bad because they're introducing people to metal. That's by no means a criticism I'm levying. But so I do think that there will be people who yearn for something heavier once they get a taste of Sleep Token or Bad Omens, and they'll find it. But will they find it at the tops of festivals like they used to? Will they find it in huge rooms where like metal has historically for the last 40 years been able to dominate with pretty heavy sounds? I don't know. I think that potentially the biggest metal bands for the rest of the 2020s might be nominally metal bands, and more so just edgy, sort of aggressive pop acts with metal aesthetics and maybe stray metal elements. But in the way that the genre is trending right now, it's sounding like this more super shiny, overproduced pop version of metal is the most popular version. It's the one that's resonating on them with the masses. And I really do wonder what it's going to look like in 10 years if that will reverse course and there'll be a band that's genuinely pretty heavy, whether it's metalcore, whether it's thrash or some other subgenre that gets as big as a Bring Me the Horizon. I'm not sure.
Tell me if you don't agree with my framing here, but in a way, I feel like we're almost in the midst of it's hard to say where we are per se, but I feel like we're just constantly going back and forth in the midst of this process. It's almost like a pendulum swing between extremity and accessibility. And, in one direction or the other, there's going to be benefits and there's going to be repercussions. You could get so extreme that you eventually just start, kind of become unappealing to everybody. And the thing is, while obviously in metal music, the extremity, the shock, the horror, the whatever it is that you're kind of like, deriving that from, be it through the music or the content and the lyrics, the imagery and the album cover or whatever, the way you present the live show. Obviously there's going to be a certain amount of people who are into that, but you sort of also need those more A-list acts that kind of, I guess, become a gateway, like you were saying earlier, to sort of like, maybe kind of like soften people to the idea of something darker down the road or whatever, and to me, I feel like there's been various points in metal, even at its roots, where because it was a genre that was starting out, it was in its infancy, and obviously it was presenting some form of darkness and extremity in the earliest works of like Iron Maiden and Sabbath, for example. They still had to have some kind of concessions or some kind of like greater appeals to the larger public in the music that would sort of speak to, I guess, a more mainstream ear. I mean, when you listen to that debut Black Sabbath album, most of the tracks on the record don't necessarily vibe in the same way that like the title track does. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of songs on that record that are super melodic and are actually kind of like blues rock songs. A lot of Tony Iommi's work during that point was just super, super bluesy in terms of like the licks and the riffs and so on and so forth. And, you could say to an extent, like Black Sabbath was embracing a lot of rock aesthetics that were super accessible at the time. And, it's maybe those darker moments that long term they've been more defined by because, they're fucking Black Sabbath. Ozzy is the Prince of Darkness. And, clearly that's kind of the sound and vibe that would go on to dominate their later records. But, I think there has to be at least maybe some kind of give and take. I think that's part of the reason that bands like Ghost are as popular and are as significant as they are today, because think about how many years of metal we had prior to Ghost where the most popular bands weren't nearly as tuneful. To me, Ghost is almost like a revival of like a lot of the metal and a lot of the hard rock aesthetics that we, heard in the 70s and the 80s. And we're kind of returning to that because, how many more times can you hand audiences the same kind of Cookie Monster style vocal, before they just like kind of start tuning out because all the groups are kind of sounding the same, or the same kind of like, ultra aggressive breakdown. I feel like, you've got to hit refresh at some point and kind of like, remind audiences that, the more traditional forms of songwriting and melody, they're still important. You know, it's like it can't just be all extremity. There has to be some sweetness with the bitterness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's no arguing that Metallica, they got as big as they did because of the Black Album, which took so much influence from, hard rock, from like what Guns N' Roses were doing, like,
Yeah, it's their most anthemic record for sure.
yeah. And those songs are their biggest songs, and that made them sort of the titans that they are in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
They were big off their thrash stuff, but yeah. So and Slipknot too. I mean, Slipknot wouldn't be as big. They were big off their first two records, but obviously having songs like Duality, Before I Forget, that were these really like catchy anthemic radio rock songs, the songs that played on radio rock stations in the way that Sick or Eyeless couldn't have, helped that made them as big as they are. And certainly,
I mean,
there is a balance.
Even their breakout single "Wait and Bleed" had super melodic hook.
Absolutely. I think I think melody and metal can live in harmony perfectly fine. If you look at the history of metal, there's plenty of that. Pantera, even, who I mentioned a piece, Far Beyond Driven is an extremely heavy album that went to #1 on the Billboard 200. It's also got really anthemic choruses in there. It's very aggressive. It's very abrasive, but there's still a lot of like riffs you can hum along to, and choruses as scraggly as they are that you can sing along to. So nothing wrong with melody and metal. Absolutely. I'm not, that's something that is obviously appealing. Most people who like heavy music like some melody, they're not everyone's some sort of, bedroom black metal fan. But I think what's interesting about, Bad Omens, for example, like, and I think I note this in the piece, like Metallica brought in hard rock influence on Black Album. They weren't putting Michael Jackson parts in their music in the way that Bad Omens are playing hard rock. They're playing metal. They're putting Weekend parts in their songs. It would be like Black Sabbath was not channeling James Taylor. Like it was, for the time, they were playing stuff that was bluesy and it was melodic, but it was still like several leagues heavier and divorced from what was considered mainstream pop music in that decade.
Well,
and I think that's the distinction.
Actually, this is okay. This brings up an interesting point. Do you feel like this has a great deal to do with the absence of rock generally in the mainstream? Because as of right now, as you say, it's true. Metallica and other groups that maybe came with more of a thrash background in order to soften their sound and give it a more kind of like broad appeal. They went to a more approachable kind of hard rock aesthetic. Right now in the mainstream for a metal band, that's let's say they're the most hard. Let's say it's Full of Hell, for example.
Sure.
And let's say Full of Hell wants to sort of like, hey, let's like present guys with, or audiences with, something maybe a little bit more approachable, something that's a little more popular and with broader appeal in the contemporary sphere. Like, is there that softer sort of like more gray area popular rock band, that's just like generally liked by all, that's new and fresh, for them to actually kind of like, lily pad hop over to before they actually kind of just like make the step over to like sounding like The Weeknd? You know what I mean? Like, to me, like those kind of like those middle ground acts in rock music, aren't quite there to kind of like, bridge that gap per se. There's like, some of the only acts that you probably could say could present that opportunity are maybe more legacy style, like Foo Fighters. You know what I mean? It's like there's not a whole lot of newer, younger bands out there that have like a new fresh rock sound for somebody to kind of like, I guess hybrid bring together to sort of create that middle point. If you're looking for something that's like pop mainstream, to sort of like, create a bit of a cross appeal, it's got to be an R&B thing. No?
No, yeah. I mean, unless you're pulling from Greta Van Fleet.
Exactly. Who, I mean, while they're a new band in their own right, they're also a legacy act because of how much of a nostalgia trip it is.
Yeah, I do think the absence of rock is maybe certainly like played a part in that, and to an extent. But I just also think like we live in a time where it's totally cool, and I think this is cool, where metalheads can like pop artists, and those aren't mutually exclusive in the way that they maybe were back in the day, where like metal was the subculture that was like in opposition to pop and into anything that wasn't metal, essentially. And that's obviously changed over time. And I think the listening habits of people in this era, in the streaming era, whatever you want to call it, tend to be more diverse and influences because anything is on the table. So I just think that there's not like the stigma that there once was, and there's also the ability, I think, with modern production for really glossy synth pop to be infused into metal in a way that maybe would have sounded a little clunkier back in the day, especially with all this metal, so much metalcore, especially is already being tracked directly into the computer. It's already pretty digitally processed music to begin with. It meshes pretty well in theory with sort of synth pop that a lot of these artists are taking from. Yeah,
someone in chat named Ducky McQuacks brings up the topic of Poppy. Where do you feel like someone like that kind of fits into this current paradigm, where she's obviously coming from pop music, from ambient, from experimental music, and she's made this successful transition into metal, has made metal records, recently had a very, great and convincing collaboration with Knocked Loose, and, is now effectively kind of like straddling both worlds in a way. Where do you feel like someone like that operates in this current paradigm?
Yeah, absolutely. Poppy is someone I definitely could have mentioned in my article. It's just for length purposes, it was already long enough. I didn't mention her and several other artists, but she totally fits into this, where I think it's interesting and noteworthy that she's one of the more popular heavy music metal artists of the last 5 years, and she is as much a pop singer as she is a metal artist. And that plays into the whole thesis of what I'm saying here, what we're talking about. But I think the difference with her, I like Poppy in a way that I dislike some of these other bands, because I think that she came from pop music and has an understanding and a fluency in alternative pop music that, is more advanced, I think, than some of these other bands who are incorporating pop elements, or at least she is more capable, I think, of incorporating sort of like Grimesian pop, singing and eclectic synth production and whatnot into really weird, heavy metal pop conglomerates. So I actually think her music is generally more effective at doing what a lot of these bands are trying to do. And I give her credit for that. But so I think she fits into this entire arc, but is also one of the more exceptional figures in the scene, in my opinion.
To sort of go back to Ghost and get you to kind of like define a pretty key moment in this piece, a delineation that you make at one point. You say that Ghost and other groups are sort of guilty in a way of not necessarily playing metal music, but playing with it. To your ear, what is the difference between those two things? Where is sort of like, either the borderline or the kind of like gray area that kind of puts you in one camp or the other, that again decides whether or not you're a band or an artist who's playing metal music, or just merely playing with the idea of metal music, but you're not necessarily metal itself?
I mean, I think it comes down to the sound. Basically, you listen to a Ghost song, I mean, it sounds metal, kind of. Also sounds really poppy and really melodic, more classic style pop. Doesn't sound like mainstream contemporary pop music. But it's, there's heavy riffs in that band, but really if you listen to those melodies and those vocal harmonies and the way they're stacked on top of one another, like it is very, very rooted in, like, as I said, like ABBA style pop music. They also use professional pop songwriters on their new record, which I think is an interesting note and should be considered for thinking about what a metal band is versus what, how a pop singer would operate using co-songwriters and whatnot, which again, that's kind of value neutral. I don't think that's necessarily bad. I also don't think Ghost music is bad, for the record. It's not my thing personally, but I think that the whole approach of their band, I think the conceit of their music is like, they kind of toy with the fact that they're not really playing metal. Like they really play up their aesthetics, are very classically rooted and sort of like, like King Diamond style makeup, and they're presenting them. They're very fond. Tobias of Ghost is very, very schooled in Iron Maiden and 80s style power metal and things like that, and Metallica as well. but like he also knows exactly what he's doing. He knows he's kind of pulling in metal listeners and metal fans with sort of the aesthetics and the sort of appeals of traditional metal and playing with some of those elements while also getting metal fans to listen to music that's 10 times more melodic than basically any other metal band. Like even the influences that the more metal influences that they have. I mean, Ghost are another level of catchy.
Yeah, I mean,
And I think,
to me, that was also kind of like what was so refreshing about Ghost out of the gate, because it's like, I feel like, metal has so long been an institution that has been so insular and also defined by a very rigid set of expectations and boundaries that, like you say, Ghost did actually kind of get some people who for the first time in a long time were actually like, oh man, it's like a song can just be catchy. It doesn't have to be like the hardest thing ever per se. Like it can appeal on other fronts. And, to me, at least, it's still metal to my ears, and like it still feels metal to me. I think even the conceit of sort of like embracing kind of pop songwriting styles doesn't necessarily mean that it's kind of lost its metal flavor, because I think, there's still like enough there in terms of like the guitar tones and the riffs. And, I like the kind of blasphemous sacrosanct, sort of like presentation of the whole shtick that they do as well. I think, one thing that kind of makes Ghost interesting now about kind of bringing a lot of that stuff back is that maybe they can kind of play it up a little bit more and they don't have to take themselves maybe so seriously. There's also something that's a little Alice Cooper about how theatrical it is too.
oh, definitely. And Alice Cooper's someone who, like, back in the day, he'd probably fell somewhat more into the metal camp in the 70s, would be considered a heavy metal artist or hard. The lines between hard rock and heavy metal have always been blurry pretty much since the dawn of music. But like if you take in the last 40 years of metal and put Ghost in there, Ghost definitely trend towards the hard rock, towards the outside of metal side of that spectrum, as opposed to the more metal side. So like I'm not trying to say Ghost are definitively not a metal band, and like I don't really think it matters whether they are or they're not. I just think it's interesting that they do walk the line in the way they do, and they become so popular doing so. I think that is really what speaks to the prominence of their music right now, and them as like the throne inheritors from Metallica, essentially, being that they're not really nearly as heavy as Metallica or, as rooted in metal as some of those bands. Is like, I just think it's interesting. It sort of like speaks to maybe something about the current investment in metal and the fandom of metal and what metalheads want in the current age.
Here's a question that I feel like is probably important to address. I feel like it was kind of implied or assumed earlier, but we should probably dig into it. Like, these groups, do they collectively or at separate levels, are they actually functionally providing a gateway into metal music? Any of them? Like, effectively speaking, like when your average, I don't know, music normie first stumbles across a Sleep Token song or a Ghost song or a Bad Omen song or a Spirit Box song, is that actually leading them to listen to other metal bands? Never mind harder metal bands. Are they actually venturing out and being like, oh, this is a new world for me, I'm going to get deeper into this? Or are these groups so far removed from like the Deicides of the world, for example, that that nobody actually ever makes that progression?
I think it's hard. It's kind of a question that you could ask for the last 20 years about any really form of rock music, as rock music subgenres have shifted in more generally melodic directions. And like, it's hard to qualify. I think that probably, yes, there's certainly a lot of people who are coming in the door through Sleep Token and are then getting into whatever slightly heavier metalcore band opens for them on tour or whatnot. Or liking the more breakdowny, genty side of Sleep Token and checking out something like North Lane or checking out something like Meshuggah for that matter.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, as far you see that gent connection, like, are some of these more pop centric gent bands actually getting people into Meshuggah, for example?
I mean, I just think like maybe, and like, I'm sure to an extent, but like you're kind of saying, like, I know a lot of people who, right? I know several people who listen to Sleep Token that don't go that far by any means into extreme music, where people who have gotten into metalcore in the last 12 years, as I did in high school. I got into metal largely through the metalcore bands of that time. Uh, you know, a lot of my friends just kind of stopped there. You know, they didn't get into Deicide in the way that I did or whatever down the line. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I do think you could see a similar parallel into something like punk music, for example. Like if someone who listens to All Time Low and gets into punk music, quote unquote, through All Time Low, are they going to go back and listen to Black Flag? I mean, maybe like a few, I guess me, but like not too many others, like, and I think that kind of speaks to where a lot of more quote unquote extreme subgenres are. Like, is your average Post Malone fan going to go listen to NWA? Like, probably not, but some of them maybe. So like the gateway argument, I think, has holes in it. Like people are like, oh, just because a metal band is popular and they can theoretically provide a gateway, that means that like we should cherish them and respect them for being this effective gateway. But there's no real way to prove how effective of a gateway they are. I think you can probably assume to an extent they are, but like, is the fact that Sleep Tokens sound as melodic as they are and so disconnected from metal in the ways that they are, is that doing more good for metal than it is harm? I don't know, but my piece kind of argues maybe it's something we should consider.
In your own experience as somebody who has talked about Sleep Tokens music, critiqued it, has observed kind of the Sleep Token audience broadly. I mean, I have my own perspectives and opinions, but is there a greater awareness among their audience in terms of like spectrum wise, where the band kind of sits between metal music and also more popular forms of music? Like, in your piece, and I've made this comparison as well, you sort of point out the fact that the band seemingly has more in common aesthetically with a group like Imagine Dragons than they do with like, most classic metal bands. Like, is that a comparison that a lot of Sleep Token fans swallow and sort of accept and are like, yeah, that's valid, and I kind of mess with both bands? Or is that a comparison that most of them like think is far beyond the pale? Because among a lot of rock fans and fans of alternative music, bringing up a group like Imagine Dragons is instantly perceived as like an insult, obviously. Like, do they actually see and accept that connection themselves, or do the most of them just kind of outright reject it?
I think most of them would probably accept or shrug it. Like I don't think they're offended by it necessarily, because I think someone who gets into metal through Sleep Token, like maybe you don't necessarily understand where they fit in the grand lineage of metal, and you don't necessarily have to just to like a band. You can just like a band and not be a nerd about it. But
sure,
I do think that believe it or not. But
yeah, believe it or not, in this conversation, yeah,
yeah. No, I mean, I think that there's just like sort of a pushback to people, like the conversations we're having right now, where we are kind of like questioning where they sit in metal, is something that I just don't think is considered by a lot of fans of that band in particular, who I think a large portion of their fan base are pretty new to metal. They're pretty young, or at least are not people who are typically into more extreme forms of metal. Maybe they came from metalcore in the 2010s, which was already pretty commercial to begin with. And then this is just another sort of logical progression for them. And they just don't really care, I don't think, if Sleep Token are being compared to very, very melodic and maybe uncool pop acts, because to them, well, the music's still good or whatever, or it doesn't really matter ultimately, because what they're doing is unique and it's different than that band. So why even bring them up? It's kind of the sense that I get.
Witchy Biz says, I was just listening to Meshuggah before Sleep Token earlier. So obviously there's at least some connection going on and crossover between both acts, which I personally can see. If like the kinds of grooves, if what draws you to both those artists, or most likely would draw you to both those artists, if you really enjoy that type of groove, I could see you enjoying both those acts, but maybe one for their aggression, one for their more melodic appeals. I wanted to get a sense from you about some other stuff that maybe you don't sort of necessarily address directly in the article, because it's mostly about a lot of mainstream acts. But when we talk about some of these bands kind of like, herding in some listeners into maybe more underground or alternative forms of metal, like what kind of metal culture currently are these artists ushering listeners into today? Because, I feel like back during the 90s or even the 2000s when I was, sort of getting into a lot of this stuff. The separation between the mainstream and the underground and what kind of defined both sides of the fence aesthetically was super clear, and now it sort of seems like both sides are more all over the place than they've ever been. And, simultaneously, while this is all going on in the mainstream, what we're talking about in this discussion, in the underground, we have guys like Glenn Banton from Deicide who are, being quoted widely and quite virally as talking about how, modern metal music, especially a lot of the groups that, popularity wise, he may find Deicide shoulder to shoulder with right now. They're all Weezer looking dorks, they're not dudes who are leather clad, long beard, long hair, looking like your average death metal tough guy. So it seems like even on the underground level, there's a bit of an identity crisis going on. And, you have maybe a lot of old school metal fans who are looking around and aren't quite so much, worried about whether or not the metal fan next to them is into Sleep Token. They're worried about whether or not the metal fan next to them is some kind of a chat pile type band or some kind of $20 spin, indie metal nerd weirdo.
Yeah.
So, it's like in your own view as a metal fan, where do you feel like things are kind of being cut in what direction on the underground side? Because it seems like there's even people who are at odds on that side of the fence in terms of what's actually metal and what's actually not. Because it seems like to some, even being heavy, even being abrasive, even being shocking isn't enough. It's to them, even sounding as I don't know, maybe even as Melvins-esque as a band like Chat Pile does is enough of a affront to metal music to kind of get you pushed out of the metal circle.
I mean, I certainly think that the death metal world has always been more concerned with genre purism than the mainstream world. So but it's hilarious for Glenn to sort of take shots about modern death metal fans looking nerdy. I mean, he's just revisionist history. I mean, the early 90s death metal bands and fans were total dorks too. I mean, all those bands were ridiculous. I mean, granted, he actually did go to the extent of carving a cross into his head. So he was a little more crazy than the average death metal
not
artist and fan.
Not only dorks, but I mean, simultaneously, a lot of those bands were just seen as too weird and extreme to put on a platform, in comparison with the prevailing thrash aesthetics at the time,
to an extent.
Yeah.
I mean, Morbid Angel were on a major label for their third record. I mean, the major labels at the time had so much money and so much, they were so interested in any form of abrasive punk informed music on the underground. There was more infrastructure, I think, for some of those bands to get bigger than they are right now. I think that plays a part in it. I think it's just more niche than it's ever been. Like death metal bands today, the best you can really hope for is maybe you can headline 1,500 cap rooms, 2,000. I mean, really, that's a band like Gatecreeper, or I would think of as one of the biggest death metal bands of the last 5 years. And I saw them in Pittsburgh, average market in the US. I saw them play to 200 people a couple years ago. It's no way. And Sleep Token are coming to play the Pittsburgh Arena next time they come into town this spring. It's a completely different level. But to speak to what you were asking before about what kind of culture, I think metalcore really changed the DNA of metal in so many ways from the early 2000s onward, in terms of becoming the most predominant form and the most popular form of metal of the last 15 years, especially the last 10 years. And certainly changing the aesthetics of metal. Metalcore came from hardcore initially. It was a genre that was opposed to the sort of metal theatrics and sort of horns up metalness, violent lyrics, Satan themed music that kind of defined metal in the 80s and the early 90s. And then it just became music you can listen to in your average fucking clothes you wear to school or whatever. And then, people, the aesthetics of metal changed because of that. The lyrical topics changed. Metal became something you don't have to sing about demons. You don't have to sing about violence. You could sing about being emo, or you could sing about Jesus if you're under oath or something, And then that sort of, I think, just people getting into the genre through metalcore never had that experience with having to put on your bullet belts and have to wear kind of crazy outfit. You don't even have to have long hair. You can just be a genuine, like sort of normal looking guy, like I am, I guess, and you can like metal and be involved in that culture. So I think like the sort of subversive identity, the outsider identity of metal has been waning for years. There's obviously a small, it has always been a fertile underground of like true weirdos and people who like to, you know, wear the dress up and get super into it and be true outsider culture. But like I feel like the general, sort of aesthetic of popular metal for the last 20 years now has been pretty like average, pretty normie looking, kind of normified in a way. And I think that that's like makes the genre hard in some ways to distinguish between other genres. So like if someone's getting into like I think like Sleep Token are kind of, maybe the fact that they do embrace masks and sort of theatrics, and it makes them unique and makes them something that people want to buy into because they feel sort of special and sort of cryptic and mysterious. But like most of their peers just look like completely average people, and like then maybe their music sounds a little heavier, but like distinguishing between what that culture is versus just like kids who are into rap music or other forms of rock music. I mean, visually and sort of spiritually or whatever in terms of their ethos is not a whole lot of differences. And I think metalcore has a lot to do with that.
Another thing that I feel like is kind of worth bringing up here is the changes metalcore made, various groups kind of embracing these pop styles. And, obviously this has led to a bit of an identity crisis of sorts, but simultaneously, another thing that has kind of like, I think been burning the metal candle on the other end is that metal at this point no longer has the monopoly over extremity, sort of like, darker, more extreme or more out there sort of like, modes of thought and expression in art and in music that it used to have at one point. I mean, I feel like a lot of what people used to maybe get out of metal during the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, there are alternatives for that within a lot of strains of underground and mainstream punk music today, or hip hop music, or, even something as simple as like the bro step breakdown and, and shit like that. It's like that, you see people moshing, or at one point, when that stuff was at its peak of popularity, you would see people moshing to that shit. You know what I mean? Whereas like that was only the sort of thing that you would see in certain shows, certain performances, certain types of subcultures. And it's like, metal no longer has complete control over, those types of experiences, or sort of like, musical rushes that I guess, that people sort of like originally sought out metal music for. They can get it from other places. And I don't know, I think that's also got to have some kind of effect too.
I mean, the new Ken Carson album cover is more metal traditionally than anything Bad Omens have ever released, like Playboy Cardi too, for that matter. Like, absolutely. And like, there's mosh pits. I see mosh pits at shoegaze shows now, which is a genre that's popular on TikTok, where a lot of people are finding metal these days. And moshing has just become sort of like a generic sort of, general interest response to vaguely aggressive music across all genres. So yeah, I definitely think that has played a role in just, and you can see parallels with that with so many other musical subcultures, not just metal, that's kind of become part of this more generalist soup, I feel like, that we're now living in. And I don't think that's inherently a bad thing either. I really don't. But it definitely has changed, it's changed the identity, it's changed sort of what makes metal unique. It doesn't feel as unique as it once did.
Another thing that I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on is where you feel like extremity kind of plays a role in, metal's DNA, and how far, I guess, that can kind of be pushed artistically and aesthetically. Because I mean, to go back to an artist like Gatecreeper, for example, I mean, we could say Gatecreeper, they're successful, they're a popular band, they're a beloved band, but simultaneously, when I listen to them, I don't maybe so much get the thrill out of them that I would with other groups, or maybe that I did when I first heard them, because I feel like they play to a lot of very kind of like very formulaic death metal tropes, and which to me on some level doesn't feel quite as extreme, because there's not like a novelty there. There's not like a boundary being pushed per se. And, to you, does a band like Gatecreeper still qualify as extreme when that boundary pushing isn't necessarily happening? You know, it sort of seems like they're playing to a set of expectations, and that's not to take away from their talent or their ability to make entertaining music. You know, I'm just sort of like, you know, talking about extremity here as a concept. Like, you know, can you sort of like be an extreme band in concept when you're making music that is so, I guess, in a way, predictable or formulaic or set to such a rigid, you know, criteria, I guess, to the point where you're not really kind of like presenting the audience with a challenge, I guess you could say.
Yeah. I mean, it raises a bit of a uneasy question, I feel like, because I do think it's very valid. Like, I think like, yeah, these sort of expectations of extreme metal and metal in general have been set at this point, and like there's artists who are innovating the more extreme sides, I feel like, and they do exist, but you have to go to much more strange and experimental lengths at this point to introduce something that's genuinely extremely heavy but also extremely provocative or whatever. And I think like a band that's doing that well, and who I didn't bring up in the article because it would have led to a whole other tangent, but it is Knocked Loose, who are almost as popular as some of these other bands I wrote about. They're genuinely huge right now. They're about to go tour with Slipknot this coming summer, and they haven't sacrificed their heaviness at all. They're more extreme than they've ever been on their new material, and are incorporating strange rhythms and weird production techniques, and bringing Poppy in for a feature and innovating, I think, the most extreme ends of metalcore and metallic hardcore in a way that does feel genuinely novel and genuinely fresh. So there's ways to do it, but I do think that like there's less ways to make something heavy with guitars that's novel than there was in 1992, and that's just kind of the fact of the matter, I feel like.
Maybe a super tough question that I don't even know if it's answerable at this point. But you know, when we think of like the new Knocked Loose material, for example, it's so goddamn heavy. It's like so goddamn extreme. It in a way it sort of like leapfrogs a little bit some of the stuff that I've been hearing recently in the underground and in the past as well. Like, do you think we're at a point or close to a point where we're potentially like hitting the final wall of extremity? Like, do you think we're at a point where it's about as fast and as loud and as abrasive as things could possibly get if we want them to be that, you know, aesthetically? Do you think things could get much heavier, more aggressive than like what we're hearing from the Knocked Loose record? You know, could we get a mix maybe 5 years from now that kind of reinvigorates things, that makes things feel a bit more saturated? And if we do, like, would that really be to the genre's benefit?
I don't know. I mean, the fastest metal songs have been written 30 years ago. I mean, grindcore has kind of was a novel thing for about 3 years, and then it's sort of reached its limit. And there's still plenty of interesting grindcore bands if you like that, but it's already gotten as fast as it can go. It's gotten as slow as it can go in terms of the sludge metal and stuff and doom metal. So I do think we're maybe nearing a wall with the innovations that can be made on the extreme front. And that's unfortunate, I guess. That's kind of upsetting, I guess, as someone who's liked metal for a long time. And maybe that's not true. Maybe there will be something that comes forth that's genuinely different. But, you know, this music will still be new and extreme to new ears forever going forward. So like people who are older, you know, and into metal, you know, probably had the most extreme reaction they'll ever have to metal when they were a teenager anyways. And their ears have now sort of like adjusted to that. And maybe they still enjoy metal at 40, 50 years old, but like it doesn't conjure the same feeling that it once did. And maybe that's just the nature of metal in some ways. It's like something that you're always chasing that first high or whatever. Because the genre's been about as extreme as it can be in a lot of ways for 30 years. It's just like a band like Knocked Loose are maintaining the extremity that it's reached, but also bringing in new sort of modern contemporary production elements, production mixing and sounds and things to make it a little bit different, but it's really just tweaking a formula that's already been perfected.
Sure. And, you know, in the grander scheme of things, you know, trying to move outside of, you know, what we know as music nerds to kind of be like the loud music canon and how, I mean, our lives are devoted every day to sort of like logging and, sort of like
Yeah.
this anthropological study of all of it and just making sure all of it's documented. Does this potential extremity wall even matter? Because even if something like what Knocked Loose is doing on this new record isn't new in the grander scheme of things, and it's really just tweaking. I mean, every decade, older audiences of listeners are either dying or they're tuning out. And,
Mhm.
you're always going to have younger generations of people coming up who this is all new to them because they never heard any of this shit before. So, I mean, even if the new Knocked Loose record isn't new conceptually,
Yeah.
it's new to somebody. And I mean, is that enough?
I think that could be enough. Like that, if that invigorates what heavy music culture has been, which is awesome, crazy, intense live shows with mosh pits and, people screaming along to really, nasty, abrasive vocals and, pumping their fists, putting up their devil horns, whatever it may be, and getting really into it and having that thrilling experience that metal brings in the live environment or brings in even in your bedroom. And you're doing the same things in your bed alone. Then that's providing the service it's always provided, and I think that's perfectly fine. I mean, there's people who right now who think Sleep Token are the most extreme band they've ever heard because they are, and there's nothing that's cool. They're at the beginning of their journey. So yeah, I don't really think that that's like a death knell for metal, and like, oh, just because the genre isn't endlessly innovative, that it's over and it's not worth considering anymore. Like, I think that's kind of a lame old head way of looking at it. But yeah, I think it's kind of inevitable that we're going to come to a point pretty soon, if we're not already there, where like, all right, we've written the heaviest riffs.
You know, to kind of close up shop here and reference back to a point somebody was making earlier, um, is there even such a thing as a death knell for metal ever in your mind? And what we're seeing now, is it not just, again, in a way, a representation of what we see in metal music every decade? Like the biggest, most popular acts, while we can talk about like maybe there being various degrees of, overall change among them over the decades. I mean, the most popular ones do tend to be the most pop centric and do tend to reflect like some of the most mainstream trends going on. And it just so happens that, the mainstream trends that Sleep Token is embodying in their music are, just the ones that are available. They're just the ones that are available at the moment. They're the ones that are topping the charts and are doing the most well commercially, at the moment. So, I mean, in the grander scheme of things, 10 years from now, are we just witnessing just one part of a greater cycle where the next Sleep Token, in the abstract is just going to be copying whatever the hell is in the top 40 during that time and sort of maybe just giving us a darker, more brooding version of it, I suppose, with a loud guitar, DI'd into the mixing board.
I think there's validity to that for sure. Like, I just wonder what it'll look like if, okay, there becomes another, like with the next Sleep Token who eventually joins Sleep Token up at the top, are even more or as melodic and pop centric and sort of working outside of metal as Sleep Token are. Then what do these like sort of, then what does the biggest 15 metal bands in metal really look like? Is there, how much metal is actually in there? Is there any at that point? Like, because I just think that like I said, like there's the biggest bands in metal right now are operating, taking a lot of influence from outside of metal, but there's not that many extreme bands beneath them who are coming up just behind them that are way more extreme. Like there's some big deathcore bands, Lorna Shore, Slaughter to Prevail are pretty big. I think they're pretty much going to hit their ceiling if they haven't already. I don't think, just think deathcore is kind of inherently a niche thing. Maybe I'll be proven wrong. In a way that like I said, like Linkin Park got really, really big, but Lamb of God were on the radio too. Like they managed to get there with Redneck and stuff. So like, is there enough, sort of heavy extreme bands that are going to resonate with the masses in order to maintain the sort of balance that upper echelon metal has had for 4 decades, where yeah, there's some melodic stuff, but there's also some real deal heavy stuff that's really popular. Right now, it's like pretty much the only stuff that's really popular is pretty poppy for the most part. I just think it remains to be seen if that trend continues, what that will actually end up sounding like in 10 years and what that will mean for the culture and the sound of the genre at large.
Eli, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate you coming through. We've just had a
Thanks so
convo
much.
with Eli Enis, music critic and writer, whose new piece in Stereogum Metal's Stadium Class is less metal than ever. You guys can look up. We will also link to it in the D box on YouTube, along with your site and your podcasts. I appreciate you coming through and having this conversation and just being an open book about all this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, man. This was fun.
Yeah, no, it was. All right. Everybody else who's here, thank you very much for coming through. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. I'm going to let me see over here. Well, I'm just gonna go do what I got to do. Gonna log off. Hope you guys are doing well. And Eli, stick around. I'll say bye to you after this is all said and done. But again, thank you, everybody, for coming in, participating, and throwing out some thoughts that were worth reacting to as well. Anthony Fantano, metal forever. Boom, bam, bye. Bye, boom, boom. Okay, cool.